The Texas air was dry and heavy, thick with the dust of a promise that seemed to splinter under the weight of soldiers' boots. At the Barrett Ranch, the silence wasn't of peace, but of omen. 10 men on horseback, the midday sun glinting off their rifles, formed a semicircle before the simple wooden house. Leading them, astride a black stallion that seemed sculpted from arrogance itself, was Colonel Alejandro Vargas. His uniform was immaculate, adorned with medals he had won not in fair battles, but in games of power and intimidation. His eyes, small and dark, swept over the property with a disdain that turned fertile land to dust. Before him, standing on the porch, was Caleb Barrett. 19 years old, he possessed the build of someone who had worked the land since he could walk, but his shoulders bore the weight of a man's responsibility. Beside him, her hand clenched on the doorframe, stood his younger sister, Eliza Whitaker, her face as pale as the magnolia bloom that grew by this well. Inside, their mother prayed in whispers, asking God for an intervention that seemed ever more distant. This land, Colonel Vargas began, his voice cutting like broken glass, belongs, by decree of the new governor, to the Mexican army. It is of national interest. You have until tomorrow's sunset to gather your belongings and depart. Caleb didn't move. His eyes were fixed not on the colonel, but on the small rise behind the house, where a solitary oak cross marked his father's resting place. A man who had fought at San Jacinto, who had bled so that this patch of earth could be called Texas, a free place. This land has an owner, and his name is carved on that cross, Caleb said, his voice low but firm as the rock beneath his feet. His blood bought it. No decree can erase that. Vargas let out a short, scornful laugh. Blood? The blood of rebels only serves to fertilize the soil for its new masters. Your father chose the losing side, muchacho. Don't make the same mistake. The colonel dismounted with practiced fluidity. He walked slowly to the porch, his steps echoing like hammer blows on a coffin. He stopped inches from Caleb, so close the young man could smell the tobacco and cheap authority. Vargas didn't look at Caleb, but at the small sun-faded Texas flag tacked to the wall beside the door. With a swift movement, he ripped it down, the sound of tearing fabric like a scream. He threw it on the ground and stomped on it with his mud-caked boot. Your heroes? Time is over. There is no more Crockett, no more Houston. There is only order. My order. Eliza let out a stifled sob. Caleb clenched his fists so tightly his fingernails dug into his palms. A quick, hot, painful flashback flooded his mind. His father, sitting by the campfire, cleaning his rifle. Never forget, son, he had said. Courage isn't about the size of your army, but the size of your conviction. Davy Crockett taught us that. A man standing for what's right is an army in himself. Caleb had seen the signs of danger approaching, the rumors of land being taken, of laws changing overnight. But he, like so many others, had kept faith in the promise of Texas, in the idea that justice would prevail. Now, injustice stood there, trampling his pride, his history. The colonel turned to remount his horse, a satisfied smile on his face, like one crushing an ant for pleasure. He didn't give a second glance to the boy he left behind, stripped and humiliated. He saw no threat in a young face, marked by pain. He didn't know that pain, in Texas, doesn't just produce tears, it forges steel. As the colonel and his men rode away, raising a cloud of dust that swallowed the sun, the hot desert wind seemed to shift. It brought not the sound of distant drums or horses, but a deep, unnerving silence. It was not a silence of defeat, but of concentration. In Texas, one learns early that the most dangerous storm is the one that brews without thunder, the one that gathers in a man's heart until the only thing left to do is to break over the world. And Caleb Barrett's heart had begun to gather clouds. The humiliation was a slow poison that spread through the community. The next day, the Barrett family left their home in a wagon loaded with the little they could carry. Neighbors watched from their windows, hearts heavy with sympathy and fear. No one offered help, not out of unwillingness, but out of the terror Colonel Vargas's name inspired. He had turned the Barrett Ranch into his local headquarters, a visible daily symbol of his power. The laughter of his soldiers echoed through the valley where before only the song of birds and the lowing of cattle could be heard. Caleb found shelter for his mother and sister at the small farm of Amos Carson Mercer, an old rancher with a grizzled beard and eyes that had seen the rise and fall of many flags. Amos had been his father's friend, one of the few who still spoke of the Revolution days with fire in his eyes. "What are you going to do, boy?" Amos asked that first night, watching Caleb stare fixedly at the lights now burning in his old home. "Pick up a rifle and die like a fool?" Caleb shook his head, his gaze lost in the distance. "Dying is easy, Amos. It's living with dishonor that's hell. The Colonel doesn't just want our land, he wants our soul. He wants us to believe we're weak, that our heroes died in vain. Every laugh that comes from that house is another nail in the coffin of this valley's hope." Vargas's arrogance was boundless. He held parties at the confiscated ranch, inviting corrupt politicians and businessmen who saw opportunity for profit in the new order. He paraded through town like an emperor, confiscating supplies from merchants under the guise of military necessity and meting out punishments to anyone who dared question him. To cement the fear, he accused a farmer, Jacob Bailey, of conspiring against the government and had him whipped in the town square. The message was clear. Resistance would be brutally and publicly crushed. Caleb watched from afar, bile rising in his throat. It wasn't rage he felt, but a calculated coldness. Rage was a consuming flame. What grew within him was ice, hard and sharp. He tried the official channels. He went to the town judge, a man who used to fish with his father. The judge barely looked him in the eye. "The law is the law, Caleb. These are changing times. Best to adapt." Caleb understood. Fear was a chain, and the Colonel held all the ends. He was alone. That night, in Amos's barn, he found an old wooden chest that had belonged to his father. Inside, among tools and yellowed letters, was his father's hunting knife. The handle was polished bone, and the blade, though old, still held its edge. His father had told him that knife was a gift from Davy Crockett after a bear hunt in the Smoky Mountains, long before Texas dreamed of being free. Crockett wasn't just strong, son. The memory of his father's voice echoed in his mind. He was clever. He knew that sometimes the best way to defeat a bear isn't to face it head on, but to understand its nature and use the forest to your advantage. Caleb held the knife. It wasn't a weapon he saw, but a symbol, a reminder. The Colonel was the bear, arrogant, powerful, and convinced of his own strength. But every bear has its blind spot, its weakness. Vargas didn't fear rifles. He had more rifles than everyone in the valley combined. He didn't fear the law. He was the law. So, what did he fear? Looking into the darkness of the barn, with the smell of hay and old gunpowder in the air, an idea began to take shape. A dangerous, silent idea, sharp as the blade in his hand. Every humiliation the Colonel inflicted on the valley wasn't breaking Caleb's spirit. It was giving him the pieces of a puzzle. The Colonel didn't know it, but by stomping on that ranch, by desecrating that flag, he hadn't awakened an enemy. He had awakened the legacy of a people who learned to fight in the shadows, to win with cunning, to turn faith into a weapon. The wrong man had just been awakened. Caleb's plan didn't start with gunpowder, but with words. He spent the following weeks observing, listening, learning. He was no longer the farmer's son. He was a shadow moving along the edges of town, his ears attuned to the whispers of Vargas's soldiers, the conversations of merchants, the prayers in church. He noted the colonel's routine, his need for public display, his obligatory presence at Sunday Mass, his habit of crossing himself 3 times when passing the cemetery. He seemed a man of faith, but it was a performative, superficial faith designed to project an image of piety and order. It was armor, and Caleb was looking for the seams. It was then that he returned to Amos Carson Mercer, not to ask for guns or men, but for wisdom. Amos, you knew men like him in the war. What does a man who has all the power in the world truly fear? The old rancher studied him for a long moment, his pipe hanging in the corner of his mouth. He saw that the youthful fury in Caleb's eyes had been replaced by a cold determination. Power isn't what they have, boy. It's what they're afraid of losing. A man like Vargas doesn't fear a bullet in the back. He fears dishonor. He fears looking weak in front of his own men. His authority doesn't come from the law, but from the illusion of his strength. Break the illusion, and you break the man. Amos told Caleb that Vargas came from a proud family in Mexico, a lineage of military men who boasted of their honor and Catholic devotion. For them, the perception of cowardice or sacrilege was a stain worse than death. Vargas's weakness wasn't pride. It was the fear that his pride would be exposed as a fraud. With this key, Caleb began to work. He didn't rally neighbors with fiery speeches. He planted seeds. He began frequenting the same cantina as the lower-ranking soldiers. He spoke not of rebellion, but of folklore. He told old tales of the region, stories of earth spirits that guarded the graves of the just, of curses that befell those who disturbed the sleep of the dead. He spoke of how the Texas land had memory and how the blood spilled upon it cried out for justice not to men, but to God. The stories, like seeds on the wind, spread. The soldiers, simple, superstitious men from distant villages, began to feel uneasy. They started looking at the rise behind the Barrett Ranch, where the solitary cross seemed to watch them day and night with a new apprehension. One night, one of the colonel's horses fell mysteriously ill. On another, a sudden storm toppled the mast where the Mexican flag flew. Accidents, perhaps, but in the atmosphere Caleb had created, they seemed like omens. Caleb's small victory came when he intercepted a message, not through espionage, but through pure observation. He noticed a messenger who always stopped to drink at the creek before arriving at the ranch. Caleb simply offered the man a canteen of fresh water, and while the man drank, Caleb read the address on the envelope he carried. It was a letter to the Archbishop in San Antonio. Vargas was seeking the church's blessing for his actions, trying to solidify his image as a pious leader. Caleb's plan crystallized. He didn't need an army. He needed a stage, an audience, and a single symbol. The feast of San Juan, the patron saint of the small town, was approaching. It was the biggest event of the year, a day when the entire community, including the colonel and his garrison, would gather in the square before the church for an open-air mass. It would be there. It would be in front of everyone, in front of his men, in front of the people, in front of God. As the sun rose over the hills on the day of San Juan's feast, no one noticed the solitary figure making his way to the cemetery on his former property. Caleb carried no rifle. He carried a shovel, The powerful laughed at the landless boy, the young man who seemed to have accepted his defeat. Little did they know that Caleb Barrett's silence was the sound of a trap being set piece by piece on the most dangerous ground of all, the soul of the colonel himself. The trap was ready. The day of San Juan's feast dawned clear and unforgiving. The sun beat down fiercely on the town square, which was packed. Farmers, merchants, women in their finest dresses, and children running between the adults' legs. Everyone was there, their faces a mixture of festive devotion and barely concealed anxiety. At the center of it all, on a makeshift platform in front of the church door, stood Colonel Vargas. His uniform seemed even more polished, his medals shining like tiny suns. He was at the zenith of his power, basking in the forced attention of the people he oppressed. His soldiers formed a cordon, their rigid postures projecting an aura of absolute control. The priest began the Mass, his voice trembling slightly under the colonel's watchful gaze. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and fear. Vargas was beginning to realize he had underestimated the valley's silence. In the past few days, his men had been restless, exchanging nervous glances and speaking in hushed tones about ill omens. He had reprimanded them, calling them superstitious peasants, but a seed of doubt had been planted in his own mind. He felt the people's gazes upon him, and for the first time, he saw not just fear, but something more: expectation. It was at the most solemn moment of the Mass when the priest raised the host and a profound silence fell over the square that Caleb's plan materialized. A movement in the crowd drew everyone's attention. The people parted, opening a corridor. Down the corridor walked Caleb Barrett. He looked at no one, neither left nor right. His eyes were fixed on Colonel Vargas. He carried no weapon. On his shoulders, he carried the oak cross that had marked his father's grave. The wood was heavy, weathered by sun and rain, and the soil from his ranch still clung to its base. He walked slowly, each step deliberate and heavy, the sound of his boots on the dust, the only noise in the silent square. The colonel stiffened. His soldiers instinctively reached for their rifles, but Vargas stopped them with a subtle gesture. What was this insolent boy doing? Was it a challenge? Suicidal madness? Caleb didn't stop until he reached the base of the platform. He said not a word. He didn't need to. Slowly, with an effort that was both physical and spiritual, he lifted the cross from his shoulders and set it on the ground at Colonel Vargas's feet. The base of the cross struck the wooden platform with a dull thud that echoed in the silence like a cannon shot. Everyone in the square could see the inscription Caleb's father had carved into the wood years ago, a quote from the book of Deuteronomy. "Cursed is the one who moves his neighbor's boundary stone." The air grew thin. This was not a gun duel. It was a duel of souls, fought on sacred ground in the midst of a religious ceremony. Caleb stepped back, his face impassive, and simply waited. The colonel was trapped, a perfect silent snare. If he ordered his men to arrest or kill Caleb, he would do so in front of the entire town and a priest, desecrating a mass and attacking an unarmed man carrying a Christian symbol. To his superstitious soldiers, it would be an unforgivable sacrilege. His authority, built on the image of a just and pious leader, would crumble. If he ignored the boy and the cross, he would appear weak, intimidated by a symbol and a muchacho he had publicly humiliated. His aura of unshakable power would shatter. The silence in the square was absolute. Each passing second was torture to the colonel's pride. Sweat beaded on his brow. His eyes flashed with fury, but he saw no way out. He looked at his men, and saw in their faces not loyalty, but judgment. He looked at the people and saw not fear, but a silent strength he had never imagined existed. The cross on the ground was not just a piece of wood, it was the tomb of a Texas hero. It was a verse from the Bible. It was the materialization of the divine justice he pretended to serve. With a tremor of rage that ran through his entire body, Colonel Vargas did the only thing he could to salvage the minimum of his honor before God and his men. Slowly, stiffly, he knelt, not to Caleb, he knelt before the cross. The sound of his knee hitting the wooden platform was the loudest sound Texas had ever heard. When the people saw the colonel's knee touch the dust, no one cheered, no one shouted. They simply, one by one, removed their hats. In that silence, Texas regained its soul, not with the crack of a rifle, but with the strength of a promise carved in wood and defended by the silent courage of a young man. Colonel Vargas's defeat was not sealed with chains, but with the weight of shame. The image of his forced genuflection spread like wildfire across dry prairie. His soldiers no longer saw him as a feared leader, but as a man who had been bested by a boy, a ghost, and a piece of wood. His authority, built on the fragile foundation of fear, crumbled. The orders he gave were met with hesitation. The glances he received were of veiled contempt. In less than a month, he was discreetly recalled by his superiors, his career tarnished by an incident of civil insubordination that no one dared explain in detail. He was not punished with imprisonment, but with something worse for a man like him, irrelevance. The new commander, a more pragmatic officer, revoked many of the land confiscation orders, seeking to appease the local population. The first property to be returned was the Barrett Ranch. Caleb, his mother, and his sister returned home. The place was neglected, but it was whole. The first thing Caleb did was carry the oak cross back to the small rise and firmly plant it in the soil that guarded his father's remains. He felt not the triumph of vengeance, but the deep peace of justice. He had not needed to spill blood to honor the blood his father had spilled. He had won because he was loyal to his father's memory, true to his faith, and intelligent enough to understand that true strength lies not in violence, but in truth. The community, now free from the yoke of fear, looked at Caleb with newfound respect. He was not a gunslinger or a revolutionary, but he had become a leader who showed them that courage didn't need to shout to be heard. Amos Carson Mercer visited him the day the family resettled. The old rancher sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the reclaimed land. "Your father and Crockett would be proud, boy," Amos said, his voice thick with emotion. "You fought with the most powerful weapon of all, honor. You reminded them that this land has a soul, and souls cannot be conquered." The story of the boy who made the colonel kneel without a word became a local legend, a tale whispered around campfires and in Sunday schools. It was a powerful reminder that freedom, once won with sacrifice, must be defended not only with rifles, but with intelligence, faith, and an unwavering refusal to bow to tyranny. Texas belonged not to those who shouted the loudest or had the most guns. It belonged to those who stood their ground even in silence, as firm as the oak on the hill. Those who understood that justice in Texas never ends with the last shot. Sometimes it is the silence that punishes deepest and the freedom that flourishes in its wake. He tried to destroy that man, but ended up destroying himself. In Texas, true revenge is living free when the enemy lives bound to their own past. If this story of honor, courage, and the indomitable spirit of Texas resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more tales like this. Share it with everyone who identifies with the pride of defending what is just. And don't forget to comment from what part of the world you're watching so we know how far the spirit of freedom travels.